1991 was the peak of a worldwide recession. It is also the year that Mercedes released the W140. Now, it is said that they spent over $1 billion in developing it. It is now considered the best S-Class ever made. But at launch, it got a frosty reception. The Bruno Sacco pen lines were supposed to be a bit too dumpy, ill-proportioned, and the car generally was thought to be a symbol of excess in a time when things weren't going quite so well. But it was also an engineering marvel. Soft closed doors, double glazing, and what double glazing? The thickness of it, and the fact that the interior panel goes up higher than the external one, very different from what came in the later cars. The boot has a retractable handle, so you don't get your hand dirty when you're going to close it, and early models even had pop-up aerials at the side so that when you were reversing you could tell where the back of the car was. The seats adjusted every which way. The V12s came as standard with self-leveling suspension, and of course they were built like no other car before or after it. The design may have been panned as not being particularly delicate or pretty, but it does mean that from the previous car, which had a CD of 0.37, this went down to 0.3, making it much more efficient. Unfortunately though, it did also weigh an extra 300 kilos over the previous car. In terms of refinement, there was absolutely no compromise, but where it surprised most was that it could handle a series of S-bends without anywhere near as much drama. It wasn't quite a BMW 7 Series, but it was greatly improved. They were made between 91 and 98. In that time, there were two quite minor updates. The Phase 2's got clear indicators, a different grille, other little things, and the Phase 3's went away from the two-tone bodywork to one solid colour. Engine-wise, the six-cylinder smaller engines are much less desirable. The V8s are much better, and this one is the daddy. It's the V12. Now, I remember seeing these cars in the 90s when they first came out, and they had such a presence about them. I always used to wonder, you know, who could be in that car? Who is so important? They sort of carried a sense of mystique. I think that is part of the appeal that they have today. More than that, though, is the utter solidity and the quality with which they were made. I myself own one of the later cars, a 500 CL. And although it is a brilliant car, the interior just doesn't have the same sense that everything has been meticulously built to a high standard. Mercedes, in this point in time, we're just thinking about everything. The instrumentation is super clear. I'm not even sure if these sort of layouts of the 90s Mercs, if they've ever really been bettered. This one though, we can't really talk about it without that V12. The previous generation makes do with the V8s. This one though puts out almost 400 horsepower. Let's see how it feels today. This thing really goes. I mean, it started off in second gear, I think, and as I put my foot down, it just went down to first. And it made a noise, and it responded with, you know, quite an instantaneous urge that isn't something that a car like this should really do. Out of the sort of top-end luxury cars, the engine still feels like it has a sporting bent that you're not expecting. Especially when this car weighs, in this trim with this engine, it's 2.2 tons. That was truly shocking in a positive way. It also takes on, normally you can hardly hear the V12 to be honest, but once it goes past 4,000 it just gets a harder edge to it. I'd almost call it sporty. On these sort of faster flowing sweepers, it's also a big step forward in the way that it sort of controls body movement. When you come to sort of tighter turns like this, it still holds it together relatively well. Although when you're moving from one extreme to the other and you have the added movement from one side to the next, then it does lose its composure a little bit more. Let's just do another sort of throttle to the floor run, because that engine is surprising. We have to remember that Zonda got this very engine. Admittedly, they modified it quite radically. So the fact that it feels the way it does maybe shouldn't be quite as surprising as it is, but that's not why people would have bought a car like this. It's for its overall comfort and continent demolishing ability. And on that front, it still does pretty well. Even today, it would be hard to criticize in terms of the overall sort of dynamics of it, the comfort dynamics. So noise is really, really contained, and that's both from the engine until you put your foot down, but also in terms of aerodynamic noise and wind noise is almost absent at the speeds that I've been doing today. And having that big lump at the front makes driving it really pretty effortless. The gearbox is like butter. It's just so smooth. And the engine itself will pick up and will respond from any speed. You have quite a long throttle, long travel throttle. So that maybe takes away some of the sharpness which would otherwise be there. I find the seat could maybe be a little bit better. The platform, both on the back and at the bottom, it's just a little too flat. You can get it, you can adjust it so it's at almost any angle, but it's just not sculptured enough for me. Of little areas for criticism that I do have is that the ride, it has that sort of cushioned body control that exudes quality, but it doesn't deal with the smallest bumps quite as well as it could. So the little imperfections, the little ripples in the road do come through more than they would on a modern car. Turning circle for such a big beast is absolutely exceptional. It's a big top-end luxury car, so you shouldn't be expecting to run it on a shoestring. Having said that, Mercedes built them to last, but there are a couple of areas that you need to look out for. So rust isn't really a big deal. They were made to such high standards, it doesn't tend to affect them unless they've really not been looked after or they've had some poor repairs. But there are some areas that you should take a look for. So for example, the front wheel arches can go a little bit if the crud gets behind them, the leading edges. And also at the back, it's quite an odd area, but around the boot lock, rust can affect them there as well. And they are really complex cars. So things like all the impressive stuff, like the soft closed doors, the soft closed boot, all those little things, they can go wrong. So there's two separate vacuum pumps that govern all those little bits and bobs. If those can go wrong, either the pumps themselves or the vacuum circuits, that doesn't necessarily have to be expensive financially in terms of parts, but if it takes a long time to fix and you can't do it yourself, then that can become quite an issue. There's also a legacy of what Mercedes were doing at this point in time. So I think between 92 and 96, like the W124 of that time, they were afflicted with the biodegradable harness. Now that is such a bizarre idea, but because of new environmental legislation that came in Germany, cars were required for a certain period in time to have a loom that with the plastic that would eventually degrade. If you have one of those, replacing the loom I think is about £1,000, so you need to consider it. The aircon evaporator is also a big deal because you have to take out the whole dash, and it does go on these. So if you've seen that it hasn't been done previously, you should be aware that it's a big cost that might come up. For a big 6-litre V12 though, economy isn't quite as disastrous as you might first think. So yes, in town you're going to get 12 to 14 miles to the gallon, but on a sensible run you could get 22 and in the best circumstances even 25 miles to the gallon. But never forget, it's a big heavy car as well. So Andrew, who brought this one up for example, has had the whole rear suspension redone, including dropping the subframe. That was about a £4,000 cost, so not insignificant. And because they drive so well, I think that many people, those are the areas that many people don't bother looking at until they're absolutely forced to when it comes to MOT time or when it gets to be really, really bad. I think if you're looking for the ultimate expression of what Mercedes used to represent, then perhaps a W140 is the only car that will do. Prices are all over the place. So I did a bit of research last night, and I think project cars with the smallest engines, so the S280s and 320s with the straight sixes, you can start to look for those around £2,000 to £3,000. The engines are reliable and they're pretty tough, but I think if you're going to go all the way to getting yourself an S-Class, you have to go for the V8s or the V12s. Now you can get running cars, which are probably going to be usable day to day for £5,000 to £6,000, but for the best sort of V12s, I think 15 to 20,000 is where you need to look. Don't be scared off by high mileage cars, but do be scared off by a complete lack of history or evidence that they haven't had big money spent on them. As I mentioned, rear suspension overhaul that has just been done on this, £4,000. They weren't designed to be sporty or engaging to drive, but I think in some ways you might find it more rewarding than some of the later cars. Certainly the steering, although very much absent in feel and almost fingertip light. It's got a nice self-centering which feels quite natural, and it doesn't have the cloudier nature of some of the later cars. At least there's a clarity about the lack of the messaging which is coming through this. Thank you so much to Andrew for bringing it down. I've really appreciated it. If you have a car that you want me to do a review on, please get in touch. This is the best address. Thank you so much, and see you for the next one.